Friday night, you've had a long week, and that first sip of wine or beer or whatever it is just hits the spot.
Oh, yeah.
But then one drink becomes two, and before you know it, you're reaching for another.
It's so easy to do.
It really is. And that's what we're going to unpack today. The science of alcohol addiction.
Okay.
We're going to explore why it's so powerful, how it affects our brains, and give you some key insights from the research to better understand this really complex issue.
Sounds good. I think a lot of people, they enjoy a drink here and there, but they don't always realize how big of an impact it has on the brain.
Right. It's not just, oh, I'm choosing to have a drink. There's actually a lot going on chemically.
Exactly. It's not just willpower. There are a lot of things happening behind the scenes that we're not always aware of.
So the research mentions this thing called the feel-good loop. Can you break down what actually happens in our brains when we have that drink?
Sure. So when you have that first drink, it triggers the release of endorphins, which are those feel-good chemicals in your brain.
Like a little reward.
Exactly. And the more you drink, the more your brain wants that feeling, so it keeps asking for more, and that's how you get stuck in that loop.
It's like your brain is tricking you into thinking alcohol equals happiness, even though it can be harmful long term.
Yeah, it's not really happiness, it's just the manipulation of those reward systems.
That's a good way to put it. So is this similar to what happens with other addictive substances?
Absolutely. And that's why it's important to remember that alcohol, even though it's legal and socially acceptable, it is a drug. It affects the brain in similar ways, just maybe not as, immediate or obvious sometimes. Think about it. How often do you hear someone say, oh, I need a drink to relax?
All the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if they said they needed, something else to unwind, it would be viewed very differently.
It's so normalized we forget that it is a substance that's affecting our brains.
Yeah, and over time, that enjoyment, that seeking out the feel-good feeling, you can turn into something more serious, like alcohol use disorder.
So it can go from I'm just having a good time to an actual disorder.
Exactly, and it happens in stages.
Well, there are stages to this.
Yeah, it starts with just enjoying that initial buzz, having a good time. But as you continue, you might develop a tolerance, meaning you need more to get the same effect.
Oh.
And that's when you might enter the negative affect withdrawal stage, where you experience negative emotions if you're not drinking.
So it goes from seeking pleasure to avoiding discomfort.
Exactly, and this is where habituation comes in. Have you ever noticed how if you do something repeatedly, it becomes a habit?
Like brushing your teeth or something.
Exactly. Same thing with alcohol. The more you use it to cope with stress or emotions, the more it becomes ingrained in your brain.
It's like our brains are being rewired without us even realizing it.
In a way, yes. And if it goes on long enough, it can even get to a point where your life revolves around that next drink.
That's scary. And I imagine those cravings get stronger the further you go in the cycle.
Yes, it becomes more and more difficult to break free at that point.
Wow. So we've talked about cravings, but what about the physical effects on the brain? Everyone knows about liver damage, but I was surprised to learn about the connection between alcohol and dementia.
Yeah, most people associate dementia with aging, which it is, but long-term alcohol use is a major risk factor.
Really?
Yes. And there's another condition called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, which is directly linked to a thiamine deficiency. And heavy drinking can interfere with the body's ability to absorb thiamine.
So alcohol can actually lead to a vitamin deficiency.
Exactly, and that deficiency can have some serious consequences for the brain, like memory problems, difficulty with balance and coordination, even vision problems in some cases.
It's amazing how much damage can be done without us even realizing it.
It's a gradual process, and that's what makes it so dangerous.
It really highlights the importance of understanding these long-term consequences, not just the immediate effects of a night out.
Absolutely, and that's something we need to talk more about. The physical damage is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right, because then there's the whole psychological and social impact as well, which I think is a whole other conversation.
Exactly, and it's all interconnected.
So we've been talking about the physical effects of alcohol on the brain, but it's not just about the physical damage, right? There's this whole other aspect of how alcohol affects our mental and social lives.
Absolutely, it's like that coping mechanism trap that the research talks about, where you start using alcohol to deal with stress or difficult emotions.
Yeah, totally. Like you've had a rough day at work, you're feeling super stressed, and suddenly that glass of wine starts to seem really tempting.
Right, it's like a quick fix, an off switch for your worries.
Exactly. But the thing is, it's not actually dealing with those underlying issues, it's just masking them for a bit.
Yeah, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a much larger wound.
That's a great analogy. So then you feel better temporarily, but those problems are still there, simmering under the surface.
Exactly, and then the more you rely on alcohol to cope, the more those feelings come back when you're not drinking, creating this vicious cycle,
So you're basically just digging yourself deeper into a hole.
pretty much.
Yeah.
And speaking of different ways people use alcohol, the research mentions these different types of drinkers, which I found really interesting.
Oh, yeah, I remember that part. There are the social drinkers, right?
Mm.
Like people who enjoy a drink or two at a party, but it's not a huge part of their lives.
Exactly, they can take it or leave it. And then there are those who drink mainly to fit in with a group or a social setting, kind of like conformity drinkers.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely been there, especially in college. Like everyone's having a beer, so I'll have one too.
Right, it's that social pressure. And then you've got your enhancement drinkers, those who use alcohol to, well, enhance an
It's
experience.
like making a party more fun or a concert better, right?
Exactly. They want that extra boost. And then, of course, there are the coping drinkers that we were talking about earlier, those who are using alcohol as a way to deal with stress or difficult emotions.
It makes you wonder, what type of drinker am I? Or my friends? Not to label anyone, but it's just
Hmm.
interesting to think about.
Right. It's not about judgment. It's just about awareness. And it's not always fixed either. Someone could be mostly a social drinker, but then maybe during a particularly stressful time, they lean more on coping drinking.
It's all about recognizing those patterns in ourselves and others. And it makes me think about the role of genetics in all of this. Like, can we blame our genes for a predisposition to alcohol addiction?
Well, it's definitely not that simple. The
Mm.
research suggests that it's this complex mix of nature and nurture. Genetics plays a role for sure, but it's not the whole story.
So it's not like having a specific alcoholism gene.
Not at all. It's more like a combination of genes that might make someone more susceptible, but environmental and social factors are huge.
So even if addiction runs in your family, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed to follow that path.
Exactly. You have a choice in all of this.
Hmm.
Your environment, your upbringing, your social circles, stress levels, even cultural norms. All these things play a part.
It's like that old saying, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you do with it.
Exactly. Understanding your risk factors can actually be empowering because it lets you make more informed choices about your relationship with alcohol.
So knowledge is power, basically.
In a way, yes, because it helps you take control instead of feeling like you're at the mercy of your genes.
That's a really positive way to look at it. And it kind of leads into the next thing I wanted to discuss, which is the whole issue of the health risks associated with alcohol. We all know about liver damage, but the research highlighted some other risks that I think would surprise a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot more to it than just the liver, and I think those lesser-known risks are important to bring to light.
We've been talking about how alcohol affects our brains and behaviors, but let's talk about the physical toll it takes on the body.
Yeah, it's not pretty.
Not at all. We all know about liver damage, but what are some of the lesser known risks that people might not be aware of?
Well, one that often surprises people is the connection between alcohol and heart health.
Really? I wouldn't necessarily put those two together.
Yeah, you might not think about it immediately, but even moderate drinking can raise your blood pressure and mess with your heart rhythm.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about how much you drink at once, but it's also the long-term effect.
Exactly. It all adds up over time.
Yeah.
And then there's pancreatitis, which is a painful inflammation of the pancreas.
Pancreatitis, that sounds serious.
It is. It can be really painful, and if you don't address the drinking, it can become chronic and even life-threatening.
It's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another.
That's a good way to put it. And we can't forget about the link between alcohol and cancer.
Right. I've heard about that, but it would be good to unpack it a bit more.
Yeah, so alcohol consumption increases the risk for several types of cancer, including mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, breast. The list goes on.
It's kind of scary how many different parts of the body are affected.
It really is. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these risks and to, moderate your drinking.
Absolutely. So, with all of that in mind, how can someone tell if their drinking has crossed that line from enjoyable to potentially problematic? What are some warning signs to look out for?
Well, one of the biggest red flags is developing a tolerance. Like you need more and more to feel the same effects.
So, if you find yourself needing that extra drink or two to get that same buzz, that could be a sign.
Exactly. It means your body's becoming physically dependent.
Yeah.
And pay attention to how you feel when you're not drinking.
Like if you're anxious or irritable when you haven't had a drink in a while?
Exactly. Those can be signs of withdrawal. And it's not just the physical symptoms either. Notice how alcohol affects your mood, your behavior, your relationships.
Right, like if it's starting to interfere with your work or your hobbies.
Exactly. Those are all important things to pay attention to. And I want to emphasize, there's absolutely no shame in seeking help if you feel like you need it.
Absolutely. It's a sign of strength to recognize you need help and to reach out.
Couldn't agree more. There are so many resources available. You don't have to go through this alone.
And it's not just about individual health, right? The research also talked about how alcohol use has this broader impact on global health.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a factor in so many accidents, injuries, violence. It's a huge public health issue.
Wow. So it really does touch every aspect of our lives in some way.
It does. And understanding all of this, the science, the risks, the impact, it's crucial to addressing the problem as a society.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive on alcohol addiction, I think the biggest takeaway is that it's a lot more complex than people realize.
For sure. It's not just about willpower or making better choices. There's so much happening in our brains and bodies that we're not always aware of.
Exactly. And by understanding those complexities, we can approach the issue with more empathy, both for ourselves and for others.
Absolutely. It's about understanding and support, not judgment.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive, but keep the conversation going. Talk to your friends, family, learn more about this, and remember there's always help available if you need it.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to ask for it.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.